Well, hello, and welcome to today's webinar on the next generation of data sharing in retail. I'm David Orgel, Editor-in-Chief of Supermarket News, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. We are excited to have you joining us for this first webinar in the Best Practice series. So before we get into the next generation of data sharing in retail today, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items to help you get the most out of the webinar. If you're experiencing technical difficulty, let us know through the Q&A box or by troubleshooting through the Help widget. A quick tip for you, some common problems such as loss of sound and or a stall in the slides may be resolved by a quick refresh of your browser. Please make sure to turn off any content blockers so you can utilize all the widgets on the console. If you have a question for the speaker, submit that via the Q&A box, and we will try to address questions during the panel discussion that takes place a little later in the webinar. For any attendee questions we don't get to, we will be emailing you the answers upon conclusion of the webinar. Today's slides will be sent to all webinar attendees as part of the thank you email. Now don't forget to share today's webinar by clicking the Twitter or LinkedIn buttons at the bottom of your screen. And you can also tweet during or after the webinar. There is a Twitter widget on the left-hand side of the console, and we are using hashtag retailer collaboration for today's event, and hope you will be doing that too. Now to today's topic, which really ties into an accelerating movement in the food retail industry to grow collaboration between trading partners. Supermarket News just published a special report that outlined how fast this trend is growing and the reasons it's happening. Collaboration is accelerating because of growing retail competition, because of the need to improve the supply chain and remove costs from the system, because of the emergence of new technologies, and most importantly, really because of changes in consumer behavior and preferences. So what are some examples of this collaboration momentum? Well, Food Marketing Institute just launched an ambitious effort to build a collaboration initiative across the industry. It's called Total Store Collaboration. It will build out the substantial collaboration efforts on the grocery side by extending the focus across a wider range of categories, including fresh, private brand, general merchandise, health and beauty care, and pharmacy. This effort is eyeing some big opportunities in areas such as product dating standardization, risk management, 21st century category management, and steps forward in data collaboration. And meanwhile, all of this is building on the work that was really already underway by the industry's Trading Partner Alliance, which is focused on the grocery side and is focusing on efforts such as rapid recall exchange, facts upfront package labeling, anti-counterfeiting initiatives, product identification, and improving data accuracy. So there you have it, the big picture of what's happening in the industry today. Now I'd like to turn to today's discussion, which is about data sharing in particular. Here are some of the key areas we'll focus on today. A look at the current landscape of data sharing and collaboration, the challenges involved with current practices, the impact of these challenges on the industry and the consumer experience, and some solutions and tools to overcome the hurdles. We have presenters today who are very well qualified to address these issues. First, you'll hear from Jason Whitmer, who is President of Market Research at Cleveland Research, and then we'll have a presentation from Jonathan Golovin, who is CEO of Retail Solutions, Inc. After that, we'll have a panel discussion on key topics related to this issue. So we got a lot of good things to cover, and at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Jason Whitmer of Cleveland Research. Jason?
Thank you, David, and thanks for everybody for joining us. I have 5 slides that I would like to talk about as it relates to the environment that we see it, and finish with real actionable, so what, some more conclusions or some takeaways that hopefully you can put into thought with you and your teams. As a brief point of background at Cleveland Research, we write research primarily on retail end markets. We actually have some other industries we cover as well in healthcare and technology and industrial, but my background is writing research for retailers, on retailers over the last 15 years, primarily across food retail and mass, club, drug, dollar, and now more recently e-commerce channels. So a lot of the key end markets, particularly around not just the staples categories, but also some discretionary categories as well. But as I look at the current environment as we see it for data sharing, it's been fragmented and a lot of different versions of the truth is the best way to summarize it. But certainly if you back up even further 10, 15, 20 years ago, there was very little trust in the ability or even capability of sharing information back and forth between suppliers and retailers. And often it had this us versus them mentality where there wasn't that trust factor or transparency to even have a conversation, let alone work on projects or goals together. More recently, over the last number of years, you've seen retailers put in place joint business plans, JBPs, where at the beginning of the year there's a little bit more of that collaboration to focus on the next 12 months of setting some objectives together and having some scoreboards, which have been helpful, but sometimes those scoreboards may be different by the supplier and retailer, but yet there's a common objective set, which is a nice step in the right direction. But along the way, sometimes the information used to evaluate or set that course to begin with can be different, often syndicated data rather than real-time data. And so we've seen in many cases that data being a little bit too slow and sometimes not accurate at all as it relates to a retailer saying one thing and a supplier expecting something completely different by looking at two different sets of data. And so as retailers are putting more of their own portals together, we think that's been a helpful step in the right direction, but also there's a limited data sometimes available where it's just to the supplier individually, maybe not to the category, or certainly maybe not even to the entire store, where one corner of the store could be doing something completely different and be an outlier compared to the broader trends that we're seeing around traffic or basket that may be just as important, if not more important, to the full picture for both the retailers and the suppliers. As we consider some of the key barriers as well as fear factors that have presented some limitations for making more progress here, there's four things that I wanted to highlight. One, it really comes down to the systems themselves, where we've noticed that most retailers have built legacy systems on top of legacy systems over time that don't even communicate very well internally to get to one version of the truth, let alone provide an access point externally for suppliers to tap into. Secondly, we think that retailers really just don't have a lot of expertise in this area, or just don't have the time or the manpower to either build some of these more sophisticated data centers, put some investment into that, or then to train and deploy internally and externally. Third, we've seen a lot of new systems that have come to the table that just have too many glitches or just don't work or just lead to distractions. And we see that time and time again where that becomes the topic du jour and the focus all of a sudden shifts off of the customer or some of the key objectives as set in those joint business plans. And then fourthly, when retailers have built some portals or some nice toys within their arsenals, we've often seen them just hand the keys over to suppliers and say, why don't you go figure it out and tap into this and try to make the most out of what we've built as a resource for you, which obviously is not the most effective way to do it on a collaborative basis. So where we've seen this lead to some challenges, or what I'd call lost opportunities, we really would call out four here. All of these really point to lost sales opportunities effectively. There are other cost implications along the way or disruptions, especially around the supply chain, which we'll talk about. But at the end of the day, the biggest issue is lost sales. But first and foremost, when you talk about not having the right version of the truth around the product itself and where it's at across the supply chain, we often, and we still quite frequently, see disruptions, whether at the warehouse level or ultimately at the store level, or even the last 100 feet to get it to the shelf, which I'll talk about here in a second. With that being said, that effectively disrupts lead times, which are either insufficient or wrong, different windows where you miss shipping opportunities to get the product in at the right time, around the right season, or being ahead of the trend. Often when we see disruptions, it leads to reactionary movement and just putting out fires to catch up, and there's very little getting in front of the trends or being anticipatory of trends that we also think are lost opportunities. The third here, which you think is the most glaring of the issues, would be out of stocks. And this is, even for the best of the retailers, a consistent and continual problem, whether it's measured wrong, maybe it's measured as in stock if it's just in the four walls of the store, and we've seen very recent examples of that, or whether it's on the shelf, or where it's at in the supply chain, or maybe there's inventory that shouldn't be there or that they think is there that actually isn't, or what a lot of people in the channel would call phantom inventory. But out of stocks, very clearly to us, is something that we see persistent issues on, where we think the right amount of data sharing and collaboration between suppliers and retailers can help solve an issue that would benefit both in a big way, and just having the right product on the right shelves at the right time for customers that are looking at it, particularly considering there is nothing more frustrating for a customer in looking for an item that they can see is on the shelf, but actually not there in stock. And then lastly, like I mentioned, where we've seen some issues around putting out fires could really disrupt the ability to think strategically and getting in front of the news rather than responding and reacting to the news. One more slide before I finish with some so what is really the emergence of big data, or more broadly speaking, digital and e-commerce. There's four things within here that we've noticed, as this can be a very daunting issue as it relates just to the amount of information that's starting to develop that obviously either could lead to some analysis paralysis, or what we think is more common, it's a lot of data or a lot of information with no real insight applied to it. And so you can get overloaded with stuff that can spin your wheels without a whole lot of so what, without a whole lot of action and insight within that, which again is a little bit more looking what happened in the past and be able to find maybe what is wrong, but not having a whole lot of solution to do anything with that. Secondly, when there have been proposals or some newer systems coming into play, we think that it's been taking too long and the systems or the process is too complicated or cumbersome, whether it's just red tape of things to fill out or even the dollars involved as a lot of retailers try to make some of their portals profit centers, which I'm sure maybe we may talk about in our panel discussion. But we think that the more complicated it gets, the more difficult it is to implement, and vice versa, the simpler it is and the easier it is to understand, probably the more effective it can be as it relates to managing all that data. On the e-commerce front, we're seeing a lot of new emerging players here move much faster with much more creative tools and actually applications that can be much more customized and targeted to the right customers. And that's really the next layer of where we see a lot of the deployment of data and data sharing going, where you can have the most impact and the biggest bang for your buck on a return basis that is really just scratching the surface now. And lastly, within that digital umbrella, being able to customize and target very specifically, we have some good examples that we're seeing some great success and being able to get under the hood for the most loyal customers, which tend to be also then therefore the most profitable customers at the same time. And it's not a big chunk. It can often be just 10 to 20% of your customers, and certainly the 80-20 rule comes into play with that, which generates the bulk of sales for most retailers. So lastly, what does this all mean from our standpoint? What are some actionable ideas that could potentially be applied into your business? We want to leave you with 5 things before I hand it back to David. But one, we think it's important to stay focused on what matters the most within your business. And again, to keep that simple and focused and strategic on, even if it's just one thing, but certainly no more than 2 or 3 of what matters most, what drives the business the most, and being able to put metrics and data around that and stay focused on those items. 2, when you do have data visible, we would use data as a flashlight to lead to those actionable insights, not just to explain what's wrong or what has happened to fix some leaky buckets, but more strategically to be able to highlight what you think is most important within your business, especially in a collaborative mindset with your partner, either the retailer or the supplier, that we can then lead to a more development within the plan on a go-forward basis and being in front of the news. 3, there's a lot of existing infrastructure that is already in place and partnerships that are well-framed. So we think there's opportunity to farm the fields for what is already built, rather than building all sorts of new efforts or leveraging some third parties that can help just connect those to where what is already in place to bring together a common language and a common solution to something that I'm sure everybody wants to do, which is grow the business and doing that together. Fourth, we've already mentioned this a couple times, and not just keeping it simple, but to go after those best customers, which we think are can't be everything to everybody, but to be able to find those best customers, identify who those are and where they are, to meet them where they're at. And then lastly, if you're going to consider trying to get a return on your investments, it's not just calculate those intangible, the tangible numbers, but also consider some of those opportunities that we talked about and opportunity costs and that would be lost for just staying put and going sideways or being okay with the status quo, because there are a lot of people moving much faster and thinking outside the box that could create some paradigm shifts of which we're seeing currently, especially around e-commerce. So those are my prepared remarks. David, I'll pass it back to you to introduce John.
Well, thank you, Jason. Wow, that really helped frame the issue very well. Particularly resonating for me was what you called the lost opportunities, underscoring the sizable problem if you just kind of maintain the status quo. When you point to not having the right version of the truth and missing, whether it's shipping opportunities or causing out of stocks, or I think all of us can understand that, and it does help resonate that point. So thank you for that. So I want to turn now to Jonathan Golovin of RSI to hear his insights from his presentation. Jonathan?
Thanks, David, and thanks, Jason. So just for a quick introduction to the company, we basically are specialists that help collaboration between retailers and suppliers. So we actually act as a third-party service provider. We're not a syndicator. We simply work on behalf of both sides, where we receive data on behalf of retailers to their suppliers, and then we provide a series of tools that the suppliers can use to support the retailer. These are anything from simple things but critical things, such as providing the reports the retailer expects, the metrics the retailer expects, using the data the retailer expects you to use, to business intelligence, where if there are issues you can drill down, and then to more sophisticated applications for things like out-of-stock management, where we can actually look through the history of the store for the last half year or year and determine if there's phantom in those stores and how much you should allocate in promotions to each of the stores. So we do a variety of things that basically support the collaboration between retailers and suppliers. If you look at the range that we work on, we have actually work across retailers all through the world. We work obviously through the United States, Canada, Mexico. We work in Brazil, but we work all through Western Europe. We work through Eastern Europe, Russia, and China. And so we support collaboration with retailers, with over 90 retailers around the world. And what we're basically trying to do is make sure that each supplier can support the activities that retailer expects and, in fact, be doing the best practices in there. And we do it across a variety of channels. So in terms of who we work with, on the retailer side, we saw there was quite a range of retailers across grocery, drug, et cetera. On the supplier side, we work with over 500 CPG companies, and we work with most of the top global suppliers, but we also work with many of the smaller suppliers because the retailers would like to see all of their suppliers on their programs. So we've had quite a bit of experience across all size companies. In terms of the history of data sharing, operational data sharing, and I don't mean buying syndicated data, but the sharing of daily point-of-sale data, whether it's for in-store or e-commerce, daily inventory data, really goes back to Walmart, and they were the innovators who created Retail Link, and they made a basic assumption, a basic determination that by sharing data versus selling it, they would get all their suppliers to, in fact, focus on how they can improve their operations with Walmart. So it was really quite revolutionary at the time. That was soon followed by Target, CVS, and now we're seeing more and more retailers basically move to sharing operational data as opposed to loyalty data with their suppliers for free. And it started more so in the U.S., but now we're seeing it in Europe. We're seeing it in China, who are actually skipping the previous generation of data sharing and moving to these new programs. But it's really become quite widespread now around the world. In looking at these programs, we've seen this now over the last 10 years, and our basic observations are that there's a lot of misinformation or not understood information between both the retailers and the suppliers. So we've met with 30 or 40 retailers, and what most retailers ask me when we meet is, what data do my suppliers want, and what would they do with it if I shared it with them? So clearly the retailers understand their business, but they're not sure beyond supply chain what a supplier might do with this data. On the supplier side, it's a very uneven use of the retailer data that's shared. The largest suppliers in the world tend to make very good use of it. They have very large teams, but there are a lot of suppliers who are not exactly sure beyond the basic reporting what to do with it, and more importantly, how to make it actionable. So if they determine that a store is out of stock or has a devoid or phantom, what do they do? Do they call up their buyer? Do they call up the store manager? Do they send in a merchandiser? That whole process leads to added cost and what I call friction. It takes longer to fix a problem. It costs more to fix a problem. But as Jason pointed out, what's important is to measure the return on investment, and no one's doing that, really. So from the retailer standpoint, the retailers aren't sure that the suppliers are working on what's most important, and the suppliers are not sure how to really get the most value and take action with the data. So there's a bit of a standoff there. And, if I think about it, all these programs are really built on a assumption that if you share data, return will come. And, of course, Walmart started that, but what we find is that unless there are clear definitions of how you might use the data, if there aren't good tools to work with the data, and if no one trains people on how to use the system, you get very uneven results. And these are what I would call the first generation of data sharing programs, but the key is that they actually did start the programs going, because before Walmart, it was very uncommon. Now, we've been working for the last 2-3 years with the leading suppliers and retailers, the innovators, who are really looking now at the next generation of programs with the same data, but we call those now collaboration programs. And I'm going to explain what those are, but we're already in rollout mode with a series of suppliers, of retailers, both in the United States and in Europe. And we're in phase 1, which is the first part of a rollout in some of the largest around the world, all through, of course, the United States, but also in Germany, France, the UK, in China. And in each of those cases, it tends to be with the very top retailers who are looking for a competitive advantage. So we're really seeing now that this next generation, which these retailers and suppliers have innovated on, and on the supplier side, it's people like Procter & Gamble and Kraft, Nestle, L'Oreal, really making a difference. So when you look across that at what makes a best-in-class program, and I'll go into a little more detail of some examples, but typically it starts with a retailer's goals. What is the retailer trying to accomplish this year when they expect their meetings with suppliers, when they have their joint business planning? What are they focused on? Is it obviously growing the category? It goes without saying. So they certainly are growing revenues, but is it inventory reduction, which is quite popular because people are trying to get as much cash flow as they can? Is it out of stocks, which is a perennial issue? So it really says, where are the retailer goals? And then what is the key to translate those goals into execution? And typically that goes in a joint business planning where, as the retailer sits down with their suppliers, they say, these are the areas that we want to work on, and here's what each of us will do. So it really leads to a collaborative business process. So if the store is out of stock, who does what? and what's the return to be measured from it. And that all feeds to a scorecard to see how we're doing. So that's really the big picture. What we found is when you actually go into the next level of detail, there are really a series of things that have to happen once the retailer has set their goals or strategic direction. And the first thing is that we really need to build a program around use cases, how the data should be used to solve a problem. And I'm going to go into a little more detail about a use case and show an example because we've used that term several times. But it basically is, how do you use the data to solve a problem, and what role do each of us play? Depending on what use case you're doing, that really determines the right data. So if you want to solve operational phantom out-of-stock issues, you need to share daily point-of-sale data, daily inventory data, and store receipts or store orders. It's very difficult to solve that problem without it. Other problems, if you're trying to solve devoids, and they're long-lasting devoids, you could probably use weekly data. But it really is a question of what's the right data. And then it's making sure that the tools are there to support those use cases, whether they're provided in a retailer portal or they're provided and built by the supplier themselves or a third party. And there's several third parties who do this. And then that there's effective training in the use of the tools, that, as was said, I think Jason mentioned, this should be really exception-based so that you actually focus on what needs to happen and you take action, and also you measure the ROI. And so those are kind of the elements that it takes to be successful. And the key is that these are jointly designed programs. These are actually designed in collaboration by the retailer with their suppliers. So what is a use case? We keep referring to it. So a use case is really, at a collaborative business process, a use case is really saying, let's focus on some key process or issue or metric. So perhaps we're going to focus on out-of-stocks, which, as I say, are perennial issues. And the first question is, how do we define an out-of-stock? What does it really mean? Does it mean that it's not in the store? Does it mean it's in the store but not on the shelf? Does it mean that for whatever reason the shopper can't find it? So what is it out of stock, and how do we detect it? What is the algorithm by which we both agree? Under those conditions, yes, we're out of stock. So if you have a rapidly moving product and you haven't seen sales within a reasonable amount of time, is that how you're going to define that whatever it is, the shoppers clearly are not finding it? And if you agree on when you have it out of stock, what is each party responsible for? So, for example, some of our retailers will accept the supplier's alerts or exceptions on out-of-stocks and act on them in the stores every day. And that's an example of collaboration. Some would say to the supplier, you should send in a merchandiser if the value of an alert is greater than $30. Some retailers will say, call up the buyer and give them a list of stores, and the buyer will aggregate those across suppliers. So it doesn't really matter what the approach is, as long as there is an approach, it's understood, and it's effective. And then, of course, how do you measure success? Is it increased revenues in stores that use this versus test versus control stores? So we'll have some stores that don't use it, 10% perhaps, and 90% of the stores do this. Do we get better revenue from it? Or year-over-year improvement. So again, it doesn't matter the exact determination, whether it's year-over-year or test versus control, or actually going in the stores and looking to see if it's out of stock or not. But it's critical to see if we're making progress and if there's return from this, because if there isn't, everyone's time is being wasted. So an example of what we have done is that we, for our customers, with the retailer's approval, will run algorithms that basically say, we think these products are out of stock in these stores, and it's due to either phantom inventory, or it's in the back room but not on the shelf, or there's a devoid, the tag must be off the shelf, it's no longer being ordered, whatever it is. Those alerts then go through the approved process, which could be delivered to a handheld from the merchandiser that supplier uses, Acosta, Crossmark, Advantage, or any of the others. Or it could go sometimes to an online portal in the store itself that the store associates use. It really is a question of what approved process the suppliers and the retailers both agree to. Then, whoever takes the action, they record if the action was taken, what they found, what they did, and then we look to see if sales start again. And we, again, have an agreement on how we measure the return from that. This is an example of a use case, collaborative business process in action. And this is probably our most common one done. When people ask us, where is the lowest hanging fruit? Where are the use cases or collaborative business processes that have the most return for both the retailer and the supplier? It usually is in one of these areas. And the top two inevitably are promotional store allocations. When you look at doing a promotion and you have 1,000 stores, 2,000 stores, 10,000 stores, inevitably 10% of the stores didn't get enough and they're running out of stock and the customer is disappointed, or you have the extra cost to fulfill it later. And 20% of the stores probably have too much, and then you have an excess inventory issue where it's clogging up the store, or it's clogging up the shelf, and you have to work it down. The second most common piece pay for itself is on-shelf availability. For whatever reason, you have a devoid, phantom, etc. Fixing those two problems, doing either of them more effectively, typically pays for the entire program and produces the majority of any return in a program. But it could be new product introductions, making sure you get ACV coverage very quickly, inventory productivity, which is a real focus, particularly in the stores. How much inventory should we have in the stores? Where can we work down excess inventory? What's the cause of excess inventory? Promotional design, should we use a display, not use a display? What's the right markdown? And so on. These are all areas that have the highest return on investment. And then, to close the loop, we need a scorecard. We need a way to say, how are we doing? Are sales improving or not? Are out of stocks going down or not? Are we seeing excess inventory from promotions or not? And we have to have the same definition of the truth. As Jason said, we need to agree to how that metric is calculated and what data is used so that when the supplier and their retail partner meets, they're looking at the same calculated metrics the same way for the same period, so that it isn't, well, I only count Saturday to Saturday, you do it Sunday to Sunday. Everyone's looking at the same thing, and that's really very critical, or you spend half the meeting arguing about whose facts are correct. Where we look at where this is going, again, as Jason mentioned, two of the areas that are very interesting to people are e-commerce and social and digital. And we're doing work now with retailers and suppliers on the next generation of use cases around this area. And for example, on the e-commerce side, there's a really basic question of when you have e-commerce and you can have fulfillment from the DC, or you can have fulfillment where it's picked in the store and the customer picks it up, or you can have fulfillment where it's picked from the store and it's sent to a holding area, some area where pickup area, which is conveniently located. How do we handle the stock required to do that? Very often, retailers report their e-commerce as one store, and this is quite common, where all their e-commerce is shown as store one, and you really can't see how it's affecting each store, where the largest e-commerce is coming from, what zip code. When you start to look on the store or zip code level, it begins to tell you what products should probably be in the store that people want, but they're not stocked. And so, in fact, they're buying them online, and perhaps you should have some indicator in the store that these products, if you don't see them, please order them online, and you can still pick them up at the store or not. So e-commerce emerging, tremendous opportunity, and obviously as a percent of sales will only grow. And this is a program we're doing with retailers and customers around digital. And what we're doing is we're looking specifically and saying, okay, for a new product introduction, and we've done this now with quite a few, it's the fastest growing part of our business. When the new product first scans in a store, so you get the first day it scans in that specific store, we then do local digital advertising to the target community around that store. And as opposed to have some generic digital ad go out, what we actually say is the product is now in store so-and-so from retailer Y at this address. And come in and see it, it's at $279. So the call to action is very, very clear because it tells you exactly what the product is, it tells you exactly what store location it's at, and it tells you the exact price. And if it's not in stock, we don't do this, or if it runs out, we stop it. We do the same thing for promotions. So we put the actual price that it's selling at that store because some stores, unfortunately, don't change the price. Some stores have different price zones, so we can give the exact price that product is selling in the store with a big sign, now on sale at Safeway or Target or Metro or wherever with this address, come look at that. And that then goes and is shown on the publishers that you want, and then we measure test versus control. And what we found is with a good digital program, we get typically between 10 and 15% higher sales in the stores using it versus the control stores which did not. So that's an example of things that are the next frontier of how to share and collaboratively use social, digital, mobile, etc. Very interesting, very new. So to wrap up, we think that this is basically the next major opportunity for competitive advantage, and that the retailers who are putting out these new collaboration programs versus pure data sharing are really seeing enormous competitive advantage. And the way to get started is really with a small group of leading suppliers. Typically, people choose between 5 to 7, never more than 10 suppliers, and they do this across a set of categories so they can see how it works in different categories. And they use them as an advisory council, and together they design the collaborative process. They then run those for 3 to 6 months, and they basically fine-tune them. So they make sure that they scale, they make sure that the associates can execute it if they are, they make sure that the data is correct, which, as Jason said, is not always the case, and they get that right. They agree on the metrics, and they measure the return on investment. And they have a success criteria that says when we get to this point, we all agree it's been successful. And then, and only then, they move into phase 2 when they do a timed rollout, when they keep adding suppliers and until they have as many suppliers as they want on the system. Again, these programs are free. We urge retailers to not charge for point-of-sale data and daily inventory data because it greatly limits who will participate. And the collaborative business process, again, is a free process that people who participate have access to. The next step will be to put this into the joint business planning process as well. And we're actually starting work with that on a few retailers so that every beginning of the year, those programs or goals or strategic direction is really layered into the joint business planning process with goals for improvement, and the scorecards then watch it monthly. So we think that this is very exciting. It really is much more effective, both for the retailers and the suppliers, and is giving people enormous competitive advantage. People typically who do this are seeing at least 2 to 3% higher revenue from doing this just by getting rid of those out of stocks, getting the promotional allocations correct, making sure that the new products are roll out right on time, et cetera. So very exciting, and I will pass it back to you, David.
Well, thank you, John, and really a lot of good things for us to think about there. I really liked your 7 habits of highly effective data sharing and collaboration programs, and I was certainly floored by the point about that so few people are measuring return on investment of data sharing. That really surprises me. So what we're going to do now, we are going to go into our panel discussion with question and answers. And I want to start, we're going to have both Jason at Cleveland and John at RSI answering different questions. I want to start with you, Jason. This is a kind of a big picture topic. We touched on it a little bit already, but the nature of retail competition is changing. It's changing how business is done today. Can you give us some examples of how this impacts the retailer-supplier relationship at this point?
Yeah, it's because we've been in a tough consumer climate for a number of years now, and the recovery has been, I think, a little slower and choppier than anybody would have liked to see. It's created some ripples competitively, and again, everybody's scratching and clawing to try to come up with ideas for growth. And again, if that's everybody's goal, to grow in the teeth of a tough environment, that puts a little more of a pressure point to do it in the right way that is sustainable and long-term as well. There can be quick fixes, but I don't think anybody wants to sprint quickly over a 1 month, 3 month time frame as much as everybody's, particularly public companies, are more zoned in on getting to the numbers each quarter. I think strategically to do this together and do it the right way over time is in everybody's best interest. And so with that being said, because there's very little end market growth going on right now, it creates a little more pressure to gain share versus others, so versus other retailers, versus other suppliers in the category. But yet retailers, where this becomes a pressure point, retailers don't want to just shift dollars around within a category. They want to grow the category. And ultimately, I think suppliers do too. They just want their fair share of that growth. But to have the right sightline to be able to do that, and then to find other incremental paths for growth that are maybe untouched, and that's where e-commerce, I think, does come in play, are some things as you set the objective and set the goals within either the joint business plans or some of these collaboration processes, is to find ways to grow the pie and to make sure there is a win-win solution for both companies. Because if just one wins and the other does not, that's just not sustainable, nor is it a very good business practice. So hopefully that, at least from a high level, answers your question.
Yeah, and is it pretty much the same kind of idea, whether or not you're dealing with a very large-scale retailer like a supermarket or a dollar store, or on the smaller side, or does it make a difference if it's a fast-growing retail channel or not?
No, not necessarily. Sometimes having a secular tailwind at your back is always helpful. And so, right. but where that gets challenging, sometimes people will just ride the wave, if you will, and assume all is well, and all of a sudden one day wake up and realize, well, wait, where'd the wave go? And it settles out. And so if you don't think strategically to get ahead of that, then all of a sudden as the end market tails off, I mean, dollar's actually an interesting example right now where we've seen incredible secular growth for the last 5, if not 10 years. And certainly as more consumers experience that channel or seek it out because they're looking for more value, we've seen things really change over the last 12 months even, as the low-end consumer has been pinched, as everybody's trying to also capture those untapped markets, if you will, either demographically or geographically, and as everybody's jumped into that pool. So to be able to just find growth for the sake of growth within that channel that's been underpenetrated for most suppliers is not just that would be the easy answer, but in reality it's becoming much more difficult to just add doors or to grow organically with the same doors or the same store sales when the climate is changing rapidly, both competitively and for that consumer.
Okay, well, that makes sense. Appreciate that. John, I wanted to ask you about the topic, not a small topic, of consumers. And I'm hearing an echo and wanted to go off of this for a moment. Hello?
Yes, and
I'm sorry, I'm back. The topic of consumers, and in particular how consumers being more connected, more knowledgeable, more demanding than ever before. How does collaboration and data sharing impact that consumer experience? And I would go further by saying, how does it benefit consumers?
Well, that's a great question, because we believe that the changes that have happened are perhaps the greatest that have ever been seen in retailing certainly since the big box. And today, I think every successful retailer and CPG company sees the consumer or shopper in the middle of everything. And they have unprecedented access and transparency to price, what's where, fast delivery. It's really extraordinary. And what we really tell people is, if you're interested in a shopper lives in a neighborhood and shops at specific stores, including e-commerce. And if you're focused on the shopper, there are a set of things you have to get right, because I think, as the previous question really started to point out, shoppers can, and most shoppers shop in multiple channels. Very, very common, at least in the United States, that shoppers shop at grocery for fresh. They shop at mass or club for certain staples. They shop in drug for over-the-counter and obviously prescriptions. And the fact is, they could get any of those in any of them. And then they also shop online for either convenience, cost, or because that's how they shop. And so when you think about the store, it becomes more and more important to basically get the store right, because it doesn't matter whether it's a dollar store or it's a high-end store. If you don't have the right assortment, if you don't have the right pricing, if you're out of stock, the shopper will be disappointed. And so it puts more effort than ever on getting those things right, which means having suppliers and retailers together, store by store, or at least cluster by cluster, saying, who are we targeting and what do they want? What can we look at from their online purchases that tell us they're asking for things we don't have? Let's see if we're losing share to a different channel and why. Let's look at some price comparisons. And so particularly we find more and more focus on this neighborhood or store, and it's very difficult, because basically to try and think about supplying stores that ultimately could have half of the assortment be customized to that store, or at least small cluster, is a distribution channel nightmare, because you really have to say, how do I support this kind of precision? And we think that change is going to be very difficult, but it's critical, because otherwise you'll lose that shopper to an online service or a different channel that can do it. And of course, the online channels, they also have the question of what to stock where. But the consumer expects more and has more options than they have ever had. And if we disappoint them store by store, we will lose the purchasing at that store. And even dollar stores, we work with dollar chains, and if the products are out of stock in that store, or they have the wrong products, that shopper will look elsewhere. And I think that between Walmart and the dollar stores, there's a really interesting dynamic going of who has the right assortment for any particular neighborhood area, so who will get that dollar.
Well, that's that kind of specificity brings it to a complexity I don't think we've seen yet in the industry. So that's really interesting. Jason, I want to ask you what might actually end up being the most pointed question, the most specific question of the webinar, which is, which retailers and suppliers are doing a great job with data sharing? Are there excellent examples among both chain and independent retailers, or what even about supermarkets versus other types of food retailers?
Yeah, let me answer that from a retailer perspective, and then I'll kind of just leave the supplier side of it aside for now. But I'd say I do a lot of work in these retailers, and certainly a number are going down this path and have created some initiatives, if you will, whether it be the big guys like Safeway or Kroger, or some of the regional like Ahold, Meijer, dollar stores, drugstores, Family Dollar, Walgreens. Those are a few to name, but the one I would highlight is probably the one that most of these brick and mortar retailers think is a dirty word now. It's Amazon. And what we've seen with Amazon is really interesting and dynamic and different, not just from the data sharing, which, yes, they have their own vendor central and a lot of different tools and bells and whistles within that are very advanced from everything we can tell. But it's more of how they deploy it or how they give access to it. I don't know if everybody is familiar with what they call strategic vendor service. SVS is the terminology in the trade, where effectively suppliers pay for an analyst hired by Amazon and interviewed by Amazon that only focuses and is dedicated on that supplier's business. That's a bit of a paradigm shift. Now, most suppliers because they don't get to pick or interview that person, they're not quite sure how to go down that path, especially given it's a big price tag to do so, roughly $300,000 for a year to do that. But once you secure one, the payback on that and the collaboration from there we've seen has been tremendous, and meaning doubling the business immediately, if not more so, as it relates to even big business for Amazon, considering there's much more of a strategic lens. There's much more of an understanding of what Amazon is focused on and doing and how to execute all of that. So it talk about being attached at the hip, quite literally. That is probably the most creative thing that we've seen for a retailer or an effective e-retailer in this case that is doing a great job with data sharing.
Well, that's interesting. That ties directly into the topic of omnichannel. So I would actually like to just skip right to a question for John about how the omnichannel impacts the conversation around the need to share data. Can you just shed a little light for us on that?
Absolutely, and I think we've touched on this, that when you think about omnichannel, what it really says is that I want to be able to interact with my retailer of choice for that category, because as I say, it really differs, and I want a lot of options. I want to be able to look what's in the store and go to the store and pick it up, and maybe it's already bundled for me. And so in Korea, that's very popular, that on your way home, you basically put in your order, and when you walk into the store, you pick it up. So that's one way of dealing, and obviously that requires a lot more store labor. And the shopper does not expect to pay for that service, particularly if they're picking it up themselves. Other people want to be able to shop from home and have it delivered to their home. And whether it's delivered from a DC or the store, they want it within a reasonable amount of time. And for example, locally here, there's a service which claims they'll get it to you in 1 hour. That's really an interesting value proposition. I don't know if people need it in 1 hour, but it sets a very short window for when they have to be home. So as you start to look at the retailer, they have to invest an enormous amount in a set of systems, both externally where their shoppers, who probably determine who the consumers are in that house, have the ability to interact with them in multiple ways. And then internally, they have to have the systems that allow them to fulfill whatever that shopper wants. It's a major disruption to the store operations. It's a major disruption to their supply chain. And I think that it's fantastic for the shopper. It's extremely challenging for the retailer. And what we're finding is retailers have to invest an enormous amount these days into changing their systems to support omnichannel. And they also have to invest a tremendous amount in security, as everyone is hypersensitive to the issue of security of data, personal data. And they have to invest a tremendous amount into mobile and e-commerce. And it really is taxing what their IT budgets are. So it really adds a lot of cost, but I think everyone views Amazon as best in class. And with Amazon, any supplier can see what is selling by zip code. So they can really see down to the zip code level who is buying what type of assortment would really be important to have. And what Amazon is also investing in quite heavily in hiring left and right are category managers because they need to know what to stock in each of those DCs. If they're going to do local delivery, if they don't have the right products in that DC, you're not going to do same-day delivery. So very interesting time, very challenging, and the suppliers are really being asked to support that in interesting ways, and they're really trying to be able to be very flexible in terms of replenishment so that they can react very quickly and in some cases even do the fulfillment to the shopper if necessary, or provide staging areas. So time of a lot of change, great for the shopper, very challenging for the retailer, and somewhat challenging for the supplier.
Well, that's a really great complete answer. I'm glad Amazon came into it, because that's something that really needs to be front of mind for us on this and other topics. We have time for one more quick question before I close us out and tell you a little bit about the next webinar in the series. Jason, I wanted to ask you, because I don't know if it really specifically came up in the presentations, what are the titles of executives who should be most involved in this collaboration? I just want to make sure everyone understands the different role players.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. It's a good concluding point, considering there could be a lot of people that want to champion this across an organization, particularly around IT or even CFOs or people that own data or own the systems. But from what I've seen, and even this is a topic that came up at our retail conference last fall, of which Google was there and shared this actual data point. It was fascinating because somebody from the audience had something fairly similar in terms of what kind of buy-in do you see from the top of organizations, from senior leadership, from CEOs and the C-level suite? And the answer was decent, but it's still probably less than 40%, 30%. It's actually a fairly high number, but obviously these are people that are engaged with Google, so they may be more forward thinkers. So to answer your question, what I think is critically important is for somebody to set the tone at the top, to say this is really important, and then hand it off to the teams, both from a systems standpoint, but also integrating the merchandising teams, and maybe even the marketing teams too, that would then directly try to reach customers on a more targeted basis. That when you see a little more of a marriage between merchandising and marketing, especially if that tone was set from the top, and the CEO and the senior team is very much engaged in that discussion and in the vision and being able to then execute that, that's where we think you'll see some real progress. And not just from the dialogue level or kind of the game planning, but you put some real investment at that point behind it. And the capital we're seeing both in talent and also then in physical resources. A company like Nordstrom really stands out. Boy, half of their capital budget right now is going to all things around e-commerce. And obviously the data behind that, the fulfillment, the infrastructure, and then the systems is all very much integrated. So omni-channel, I know it's a buzzword these days, but it really is trying to bring everything together in a major paradigm shift for how people do business at the retail level. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yep, that totally answers it. Thank you very much. And I want to close by thanking our speakers, Jason and Jonathan, and our audience for taking the time out of their busy day today to join us. We hope that our audience will register for the next webinar in the series, in this best practice series. This one is going to be about alerting. It's called Alerting in Action, How to Solve Business Problems and Recapture Sales. And I have to tell you that there were some audience questions that came in during the webinar about store alerting. So I want to make clear to everyone that that will be dealt with in the next webinar, in addition to those questions being answered before that. That next webinar for your calendars will take place June 18th at 1 p.m. Eastern. The Best Practice webinar series overall will continue to be hosted in RSI's online retail collaboration forum. Visit www.retailercollaboration.com and register for upcoming webinars in the media room. Remember to check back often, because new webinars and collaborative resources are being added all the time. So that's about it. I want to thank you again for joining today's program, and to everyone, have a great rest of your day.